Roy Orbison was not just a man in dark glasses, he was a silent witness to the greatest tragedy in music history. For decades, the public saw two titans, Roy and Elvis, but they never saw the secret, unspoken tether that bound them together. As the world mourned the king, Roy Orbison kept a truth buried deep within him, a confession that would haunt his final days. Why did the Big O spend his life carrying a secret about Elvis Presley that he dared not speak to the world? Today, we peel back the layers of the myth to reveal the shattering truth. The voice in the shadow. The public saw two legends. They saw Elvis Presley, a force of nature that moved like electricity across a stage. And they saw Roy Orbison, a man cloaked in shadow and dark lenses, singing of heartbreaks that felt older than the mountains. But the world never looked closer. If they had, they would have seen the tether, a thin, invisible line that pulled these two men together, not just by fame, but by something much darker and far more profound. They were an odd pairing on paper. Elvis was the ultimate extrovert of rock and roll. He was a man who wore his heart on his sleeve and his passion in his movement. Roy was the ultimate introvert, a singer who didn't need to move a muscle because his 3-octave operatic voice did all the heavy lifting. Yet, they shared an understanding that no one else could reach. They understood what it was like to be transformed from a human being into an archetype, to be trapped inside an image created by the public's insatiable hunger. The air in Memphis in the middle of the 1950s tasted like gasoline and ambition. You could feel it in the concrete. You could hear it in the way the local radio stations crackled with sounds that were not quite country and not quite blues. It was a 706 new language. And it was being written in the humid, cramped confines of Sun Records at Union Avenue. This was the pressure cooker. For a young Roy Orbison, it was not just a studio, it was a classroom of ghosts. He stood in the corner, watching. While others shouted to be heard, Roy learned the power of silence. He realized early on that the most devastating words in a song are the ones you hold back until the last possible second. He watched Sam Phillips, the visionary owner of Sun Records, try to capture lightning in a bottle. But there was another presence in the room, a kinetic energy that seemed to bend the light itself. Elvis. He was loud and chaotic, and he was undeniably the center of the gravitational pull. Roy watched him from the shadows, analyzing the way Elvis moved, the way he breathed, the way he treated his fame like a suit of armor. Roy was there when Elvis was just a local phenomenon, a raw talent trying to find his footing. He saw the transition from a nervous truck driver to a cultural deity. But here is the question that should have haunted the critics. Did Roy admire the armor, or did he see the cracks beneath the leather? Roy was the storm. He was the thunder that rumbled just before the rain. He was internal, brooding, and deeply private. Where Elvis reached out to the world, Roy reached inward to his own pain. He did not need the roar, he needed the resonance. He stood perfectly still, a dark sentinel of sorrow, letting his voice soar to heights that seemed humanly impossible. While Elvis conquered the world with his body, Roy conquered it with his soul. They were two sides of the same coin, yet they existed in different dimensions. When they stood in that studio, they were not just musicians. They were architects of a new American mythology. But as the fame grew, the distance between them turned into a canyon. Elvis went to the top of the mountain, propelled by Colonel Tom Parker and a Hollywood machine that wanted to commodify his every breath. Roy stayed in the valley, watching the king ascend, witnessing the immense cost of the climb. There was a moment at Sun Records that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. It was hot, the kind of heavy, wet southern heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin and slows your breathing down. The hum of the vacuum tube equipment filled the small room, and for a fleeting second, the noise stopped. Roy saw something. He saw Elvis look away from the mirror. It was just a glance, a flicker of doubt that lasted less than a second. But for a man like Roy, who specialized in the nuance of human emotion, that one look was a revelation. It told him everything he needed to know about the man behind the king. It was the moment the myth began to bleed. In that brief, unscripted second, Roy saw a boy who was terrified of the monster he was creating. He saw a young man who realized that the character of Elvis Presley quickly outgrows the actual person living inside his skin. Why does this memory matter? Because it was the first piece of the puzzle. It was the first time Roy realized that the king was not untouchable. He was fragile. And that fragility was something they would both carry in very different ways until the end. It was the moment Roy realized that the very thing that made them legends was also the thing that could destroy them. We often think of icons as statues, solid and unmoving. But the truth is, they were both struggling to keep their humanity intact while the world demanded they be gods. Roy saw the trap before anyone else did. He spent the rest of his life observing the fallout of that trap, holding on to a truth that would eventually become his own heaviest burden. Two Kings in the Sun. The studio floor at Sun Records was not just a workspace. It was a pressure cooker where the history of music was being forged in the heat of a Tennessee summer. For the young men who walked through those doors, the atmosphere felt thick, almost electric. You could smell the floor wax, the ozone of hot vacuum tubes, and old tobacco. But beneath that, there was the scent of something more dangerous, pure, unadulterated ambition. This was a time when the rules of the game were being rewritten every single day. If you were a musician in Memphis in the middle of the 1950s, you were playing for your life. Every chord struck was a bid for immortality, and every silence was a risk. The artists of Sun Records, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison, and Elvis Presley were all poor Southern boys trying to escape the grinding poverty of their youths. They were hungry, they were desperate, and they were brilliant. For Roy Orbison, this room was a classroom of ghosts. He was the observer, the quiet student of sound, who realized early on that the most devastating words in a song are the ones you hold back until the last possible second. But while Roy stood in the corner, absorbing the vibrations of the room, another presence arrived that changed the gravity of the entire building. Elvis Presley didn't just walk into a room, he invaded it. He brought with him a nervous energy, a restless need to move, to sing, to laugh, and to dominate. Elvis Presley was the fire. He was the sun, explosive, blinding, and impossible to ignore. He burned through every barrier he encountered, lighting up the culture of an entire generation with a single hip swivel or a sneer. He needed the roar of the crowd to breathe. The louder they screamed, the more real he became. He fed on their energy, turning their adoration into a shield against his own deep-seated insecurities. Roy Orbison was the storm. He was the thunder that rumbled just before the rain hits the pavement. He was internal, brooding, and deeply private. Where Elvis reached out to the world to demand its attention, Roy reached inward to his own pain. He did not need the roar of an arena. He needed the resonance of a human heart. When Roy sang, he didn't look at the audience. He closed his eyes, went deep inside himself, and pulled out a pure, crystalline sorrow that made the listener feel less alone in their own darkness. Elvis, despite his monumental success, held a deep and abiding respect for Roy's vocal abilities. In fact, Elvis once famously remarked that Roy Orbison had the perfect voice, calling him the greatest singer in the world. He admitted that he would never attempt to cover a Roy Orbison song because he felt he could never do it justice. This was not just polite flattery, it was a rare admission of humility from the king of rock and roll. It showed that Elvis saw in Roy a level of pure, uncompromised artistry that he himself was struggling to maintain amidst the circus of his own celebrity. There was a specific afternoon where the two of them found themselves alone during a recording break. The equipment hummed in the background, a low, constant drone that seemed to mirror the unspoken tension between them. Roy watched Elvis. He watched the way the king handled the sudden, violent intrusion of his own fame. He saw the cracks in the armor. It was in that moment that Roy realized the most terrifying truth of all. The higher you climb, the harder the fall. He saw that Elvis was already beginning to be consumed by his own image. The playful, laughing boy from Tupelo was slowly being replaced by the commodity known as Elvis. He saw that Elvis was trapped, not just by the music industry, but by the very image he had created. And as we look closer at the path that led them from Memphis to the glittering, deadly lights of Las Vegas, one question remains. Was their shared brilliance a bridge between them, or was it the very thing that drove them into two different versions of isolation? The answer, as you will see, was hidden in the tragedy that would soon strike both of their lives, binding them in a way the public would never understand. But before we get there, we have to talk about what happened when the lights went down, and the men behind the masks had to face the quiet of their own minds. What was the specific shattering realization Roy had about the price of the crown? It was the realization that the crown was not a symbol of power, but a gilded helmet that slowly cut off your oxygen until you forgot how to breathe on your own. A brotherhood forged in pain. When you strip away the hit records, the gold plaques, and the sold-out stadiums, you find two men who were essentially running from the same demons. They were both haunted by a profound sense of isolation, a feeling that they were performing for a world that loved them but did not know them. The only difference was the speed at which they ran and the direction they chose to flee. Elvis ran toward the noise, trying to drown out the silence with excess, while Roy retreated into the shadow, using his grief as the raw material for his art. For Roy Orbison, tragedy was not an abstract concept. It was a constant, unwelcome companion that walked beside him throughout his life. It did not come in gentle flashes. It came in devastating, world-shattering waves. In 1966, his beloved wife Claudette, the woman who had inspired some of his greatest love songs, was killed in a motorcycle accident right before his eyes. 2 years later, while he was on tour in the United Kingdom, a fire consumed his home in Tennessee, taking the lives of his two eldest sons, Roy Jr. and Anthony. Roy knew the feeling of a life suddenly snapping in two. He knew what it was like to wake up in a world that felt fundamentally wrong, because the very foundation of his existence had been violently torn away. He carried that grief like a physical weight. When he sang Crying or It's Over, he wasn't just performing a hit song, he was performing an exorcism of his own ghosts. Elvis carried his own burden, though he tried to hide it under a mountain of excess, a sprawling entourage, and a glittering array of jumpsuits. Elvis's deepest wound was the loss of his mother, Gladys, who died in 1958, just as his career was reaching its stratosphere. Gladys had been his anchor, his moral compass, and the only person in the world who loved him for who he was, rather than what he could do. When she died, a part of Elvis died with her. He spent the rest of his life trying to fill that empty space, turning to prescription drugs, spiritualism, and a revolving door of companions. But nothing ever worked. He learned early on that when the world demands you be a god, you aren't allowed to be a grieving human. You are expected to perform, smile, shake your hips, and to be the king, no matter how broken you are inside. So he built a fortress around himself. He surrounded himself with the Memphis Mafia, a group of yes men who would protect him from the harsh realities of the outside world, but who also ensured that he would never have to face the truth of his own deterioration. But Roy saw through it. He watched the way Elvis moved during their occasional crossings. He saw the way Elvis's eyes would go vacant even while he was surrounded by thousands of adoring fans. Roy knew that look because he saw it every time he passed a mirror. It was the look of a man who had survived a shipwreck, but was still drowning in the middle of the ocean. There were nights where they would talk, not about the charts, the latest film deals, or who was selling out more arenas, but about the things that actually kept them awake at 4 in the morning. In these moments, they weren't rivals, and they weren't icons. They were just two survivors of a gold rush that had claimed their souls. They recognized the same hollowness in each other's eyes. It was a terrifying realization for both of them. The industry that had given them everything was the very thing ensuring they would never be truly whole again. They were both trapped in a cycle of needing the adoration of the world to fill a void that only peace could fix. But peace is a rare commodity in the music industry, and for these two men, it was the one thing their money could never buy. What happened when that void became too large to ignore? What was the moment when the mask of the king started to slip, and Roy was the only one close enough to see the truth? The mask of the king. The desert heat of Nevada was dry. It was harsh, a physical force that hit you the moment you stepped off the plane. But inside the casinos of Las Vegas, the climate never changed. It was always cool, dark, and fake. There were no clocks on the walls, no windows to let in the natural light, and no way to tell the difference between noon and midnight. It was a world suspended in a perpetual, glittering twilight. This was the new kingdom. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Las Vegas became the ultimate stage for Elvis Presley's second coming. It was supposed to be the ultimate coronation. He was the king, performing at the International Hotel, drawing record-breaking crowds night after night. He stood on that stage in his white, jewel-encrusted jumpsuits, his chest bare, his cape catching the light. He sweated under the intense heat of the spotlights, giving everything he had to the masses who flew in from all over the world to catch a glimpse of the living legend. But behind the velvet curtains, the reality was starkly different. It was cold and lonely. Roy Orbison stood in the shadows of the wings, watching. He was one of the few peers Elvis respected enough to allow in his backstage space. Roy watched the performance night after night, not with the awe of a fan, but with the deep concern of a brother. He saw the way Elvis looked between the songs. The moment Elvis turned his back to the audience to take a drink of water, the smile would drop. The shoulders would slump. The eyes would glaze over with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was the look of a man who was trapped in his own reflection, a prisoner of his own myth. Roy saw the cracks before the fans ever did. He saw the physical toll of the grueling schedule, 2 shows a night, 7 days a week. He saw the toll of the drugs on him. The world did not want a man. They did not want to see a 40-year-old human being who was tired, overweight, and struggling with his health. The world wanted a god. They wanted the young, dangerous rebel of Sun Records, or the sleek, powerful superhero of the 1968 comeback special. Elvis gave them exactly what they paid for. He gave them the king, but the man beneath the cape was slowly being crushed to death. Why did Roy stay so close to the fire? Did he want to save his friend, or was he watching a preview of his own potential demise? Perhaps it was a mixture of both. Roy, too, was a touring musician, constantly on the road, constantly performing, but Roy had managed to maintain a distance between his stage persona and his private self. He could take off the sunglasses and walk down a street unnoticed. Elvis did not have that luxury. Elvis was Elvis, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no escape hatch. There was a night during one of the Las Vegas residencies when the crowd was especially loud. The applause was thunderous, a physical wave of sound that shook the walls of the showroom. It was deafening, a collective roar of adoration that should have made any performer feel like a god. Elvis walked off the stage, his cape trailing behind him, his face dripping with sweat and makeup. He looked like a ghost who had spent his last ounce of energy to appear solid for 2 hours. He did not walk back to his dressing room with the usual swagger. Instead, he collapsed onto a stool in the corner of his backstage area. He stared at his own image in the makeup mirror, surrounded by the bright, harsh light bulbs. He did not say a word. He didn't ask for a towel or water. He just breathed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. Roy stood in the corner, quiet and still, his dark sunglasses reflecting the lights of the vanity. He did not offer a drink or a joke, nor did he try to fill the silence with empty praise. He just waited. He gave Elvis the one thing no one else in his life would give him, the space to be tired. In that quiet room, the power dynamic shifted. The king of rock and roll was no longer royalty. He was just a human being who was running out of time, a man who had traded his life for a crown and was now realizing that the trade was a bad one. The public loved the spectacle. They loved the karate kicks, sweeping gestures, and the booming, dramatic voice that filled the arena. They did not want to see the struggle, nor did they want to know that their entertainment was being purchased with the slow, agonizing destruction of a human life. But Roy saw it. He cataloged every tremor, sigh, and moment of silent despair. He kept the secret. He knew that the myth of the king was a dangerous, seductive lie. It was a lie that could kill you if you believed in it too much. As the Vegas residency continued, the tension grew. The nights got longer, and the daylight hours became shorter, as Elvis retreated further into a nocturnal existence. The quiet moments in the dressing room became more frequent, and the silence between the two men became heavier. Behind the curtains of Graceland, Graceland was not a home, it was a fortress. The gates, shaped like open books with musical notes and silhouettes of Elvis playing guitar, were made of cold iron. They were not there just for security, to keep the fans and the press at bay. They were there to keep the world out, and to keep the ghost in. Roy Orbison walked through those gates in the mid-1970s. He felt the weight of the air change the moment he crossed the threshold. The air inside Graceland felt thick, preserved, and strangely stagnant. The silence was heavy, a suffocating quiet that felt less like peace and more like a funeral that had been going on for years. The public saw a mansion. They saw a palace of opulence, a symbol of the American dream realized, a poor boy who had bought his family a castle. But Roy saw a gilded cage. He saw a man who had everything money could buy, but lacked the one thing he needed most: the freedom to step outside his own front door without being hunted. Elvis was never alone inside Graceland. That was the tragedy of his existence. He was surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, a rotating cast of childhood friends, cousins, and bodyguards who lived off his generosity. They were his buffers against the world, but they were also his wardens. They made sure he never had to face the reality of his situation, because if Elvis woke up and realized he needed help, the gravy train would stop. Roy watched them during his visits. He watched the way they laughed at jokes that weren't funny, how they agreed with every erratic decision the king made. He saw how they facilitated his isolation. It was a performance, a desperate, sad play that never ended. They created an artificial reality where Elvis was always right, always healthy, and always the king, even as his body was failing and his mind was fracturing under the weight of his addiction. Roy realized the terrifying truth. The people closest to Elvis were the ones who were slowly killing him. They were the architects of his isolation, feeding his ego and his dependencies to keep the machine running. They were enablers in expensive suits, protecting the product while letting the man die. Why did Elvis tolerate them? Was it out of a misplaced sense of loyalty to the boys he had grown up with? Or was he terrified of what he would find if the noise stopped, and he was left truly, completely alone with his own thoughts? The night was late, deep in the small hours of a Memphis morning. The entourage had finally faded into the background, retiring to their respective rooms, or heading out into the city. They took their pills, closed their doors, and waited for the next day to start the cycle over. Elvis and Roy sat in the living room of Graceland. The lights were turned down low, casting long shadows across the heavy furniture and the thick drapes. The music was off. There were no guitars, pianos, and record players spinning. For the first time in years, the king was not acting. He was not wearing the jumpsuit. He was not styling his hair. And he was not trying to be the larger-than-life figure the world demanded. He was just a tired, middle-aged man sitting in an armchair. Roy looked at him. In the dim light, the illusion of youth and vitality vanished. Roy saw a man who was drowning in his own legend. He saw a man who had lost the ability to distinguish between the mask he wore on stage and the face he saw in the mirror. Elvis's skin looked pale, almost translucent, and his breathing was heavy. Elvis stared into the fireplace, though there was no fire burning, just the cold ashes of earlier in the evening. The emptiness in his eyes was vast. He looked older than his years, carrying the weight of a century on his shoulders. He looked like a man who had climbed to the absolute peak of the mountain, looked around, and realized there was nothing there but cold air and loneliness. There was nowhere left to go but down. The tension in the room was suffocating, a heavy physical presence that made it hard to breathe. Roy did not speak. He did not need to. For a man who had spent his life communicating through the spaces between notes, the silence was the conversation. He sat there, a quiet, supportive presence in the dark, waiting for whatever his friend needed to release. Then, Elvis turned his head slowly. He looked at Roy. His eyes were not the eyes of a rock star, or an icon, or a symbol of a generation. They were the eyes of a terrified child who had lost his way in the dark and couldn't find his mother. He asked the question. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried a force that shook Roy to his core. He asked, "Do you think they would still love me if they saw who I really was?" Roy felt his heart stop. It was the question that explained everything. It explained the drugs, pills, the entourage, the failed marriages, and the manic, desperate performances on stage. It was the core of the king's fear. Roy could not answer. How could he? He was living the same nightmare, though he had managed to keep a small part of himself safe from the fire. He knew the terror of that question because he had asked it of himself in his darkest hours. What did that question do to Roy? It didn't just haunt him. It changed the way he looked at his own career and his own life. It made him realize that the industry was not a friend or a path to fulfillment. It was a parasite that would drain you of your humanity if you let it. The final truth. The question hung in the air of Graceland long after the words had been spoken. It didn't just drift away into the heavy drapes. It settled into the wood of the furniture, stained the carpet, and became a permanent part of the atmosphere. It was a question that turned a legend into a man, stripping away the gold records and the fame to reveal a raw, bleeding soul. Roy sat in his chair, watching the light die in Elvis's eyes. In that moment, the myth was shattered forever. There was no more king of rock and roll. There was no more cultural icon. There was only a human being screaming in silence for permission to be seen, to be known, and to be loved for his flaws rather than his perfection. Roy knew then that the secret he carried was not about a scandal. It was not about financial ruin or secret marriages or drug abuse. Those were the things the tabloids chased. The real secret was much more devastating. It was the systematic theft of a soul by an industry and a public that cared only for the product and nothing for the person who created it. Roy realized with absolute clarity that the music industry was a massive, unfeeling machine. It did not care about the health, the happiness, or the survival of the artists who fed it. It cared only about the output. The product was the white jumpsuit. It was the curl of the lip. The product was the high notes and the dramatic finishes that kept the crowds coming and the cash registers ringing. But the machine did not stop at the edge of the stage. It consumed everything. It ate the performer's private life, their relationships, health, and sanity. It demanded total submission, turning the artist into a prisoner of their own success. Roy looked at Elvis and saw his own potential future if he wasn't careful. He saw the same hunger for connection and the same terrifying need for validation from strangers to fill a void. If he did not protect his private self from the ravenous hunger of the public, he would end up just like Elvis, a monument to fame built on the ruins of a human life. The realization was cold, hard, and final. It was the moment Roy decided that he would never let the industry own him completely. Years later, near the end of his own journey in the late 1980s, Roy Orbison finally spoke of these things. He did not give a sensationalized press conference, nor did he write a tell-all book of lies to cash in on his friend's memory. Instead, he sat with a close friend in a quiet room, away from the microphones and the cameras, and he spoke the truth about those late nights at Graceland. He said that the most dangerous thing about fame was not the pressure of performing or the constant travel. It was the silence that followed the applause. It was the moment you realized you had achieved everything you had ever dreamed of, but there was no one left in your life who could tell you the truth. Everyone around you had a financial interest in keeping you happy, which meant no one would tell you when you were hurting yourself or losing your way. He told his friend that Elvis did not die of a simple drug overdose. That was just the medical cause of death, the physical mechanism that stopped his heart. Elvis died of a broken heart. He died because he had looked in the mirror of public opinion for so long that he had forgotten who he was without the crown. He died of a profound terminal loneliness that no amount of applause or medication could ever cure. Roy confessed that he too had looked into that same mirror and felt the same terrifying pull. He had felt the temptation to hide behind his sunglasses permanently, to let the character of the Big O take over his life, because it was easier than dealing with the pain of his own personal tragedies. It was tempting to become a monument rather than a man, because monuments don't grieve and monuments don't feel pain. But Roy realized that the true connection between himself and Elvis was not their shared fame, their hit records, or their place in music history. It was their loneliness and the shared knowledge that the world did not love them as human beings. The world loved the version of them that existed on the vinyl records, the voice that came through the speakers to soothe the listener's own sorrows. The public wanted them to remain frozen in time, beautiful symbols of their own youth and heartbreak, regardless of the cost to the men themselves. This was the shattering truth that Roy carried. The industry didn't just make them stars, it made them prisoners. And the only way to survive was to find a truth, a quiet space within themselves that the public could never reach and the industry could never commodify. Echoes of the mystery. The music stopped decades ago. The physical voices of Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison have been silent for a long time, yet the echoes of their lives and their music remain as powerful as ever. When we look back at their journeys, we are not looking at two separate, unrelated paths. We are looking at one long, winding road through the landscape of American culture, a road they walked together in spirit, even when they were miles apart and living in different worlds. What is the legacy of their secret connection? It is not a scandal to be gossiped about, nor is it a headline designed to sell papers. It is a reminder. Icons are not statues made of stone or marble. They do not live in sterile museums. They live in the quiet moments when the stage lights are turned off, the crowds have gone home, and the reality of their humanity returns. The bond they shared was a quiet, desperate reach for a sense of normalcy, a shared understanding of a burden that few others could comprehend. It was a friendship built not on what they could do for each other's careers, but on their shared need to protect their remaining humanity from a world that wanted to consume it all. In their struggle, they also left us a magnificent gift. They did not let the darkness win entirely. When Roy sang, he took all of his pain, grief, and loneliness, and he poured it into his art, creating a body of work that continues to comfort millions of people around the world. He taught us that it is okay to be lonely. He taught us that it is okay to feel pain, and that there is a deep, profound beauty in vulnerability. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadow and the king. We walked the path, we uncovered the secrets, and we faced the reality behind the myth. The story never really ends, it just changes tempo, fading out slowly like a classic record, leaving us with the quiet beauty of the music and the memories of the men who made it.